Good evening and welcome to this webinar on how to ace pre-thinking or how to develop a skill called pre-thinking. My name is Rajat Sadana. I'm one of the co-founders of e-GMAT and I'm going to be your main host today. Supporting me in this webinar, we have Komal Shah, who's a GMAT strategy expert and as well as a former Be the GMAT moderator. This webinar, a fairly application-focused webinar. It's essentially divided in three parts. We're going to talk about what an assumption is in the first 20 minutes or so. Then we're going to evaluate our understanding of what an assumption is, and then we're going to go towards pre-thinking and spend about the last hour to hour and 15 minutes solving questions using pre-thinking. Now, we want to make sure that that you're well prepared for this webinar, and to do that, we actually sent a few video lessons your way. The one video lesson that probably was most critical for this webinar is the video lesson on an introduction to assumptions. If you've not gone through this video lesson, do go through it post this webinar. Another thing that I want you to do post this webinar is to look at pre-thinking logical gap and pre-thinking two entities. These are video lessons that talk about how do you go about pre-thinking on arguments that do different things. So it uses the same framework, but helps you apply that framework on different kinds of arguments. Again, these are a part of your free trial, so even if you're a registered user, not a paid user, you should be able to access these lessons. Now, we also have some upcoming free webinars. We have a free webinar on algebra, that's tomorrow. If inequalities or absolute value questions are questions that you struggle with, then this is a webinar that you should definitely register for by clicking on this register now button. Then next week, we have a GMAT strategy webinar. Now, how many of you struggle with creating your study plan? Let's get a yes/no poll. How many of you, or rather, have a study plan? Select yes if you have a study plan. Select no if you don't. All right, let's get a few more responses. So we help people build their study plans, and we have a webinar next week in which we talk about how do you go about building your study plan, how do you define the metrics that you should track, and then how should you study to make sure you get to that 760 score. So that's next Saturday, so exactly a week from now. In addition to that, if you want to just build your study plan and have an understanding of where should you be spending your time, we do offer some free consults, so you can click on this GMAT study plan link, browse to the respective page and schedule a session. I think we have a few slots open. In addition to that, one of the things that we've also started doing is making sure that you guys can see how people who are currently in business schools, how the COVID-19 crisis has impacted them and how they are dealing with it. In addition to that, since OR1 is going to be uber competitive, you can learn from how they position their application. So this Wednesday, we have a session with Santiago, who's essentially someone who's a former entrepreneur, and he's going to talk about how he positioned his candidacy to Columbia Business School and how he made sure that everything in his application was consistent. So this is this Wednesday. You can click on register now button and register for the same. With that, let me go right into the presentation pane over here. So this is what we call as the presentation pane, which is where we'll be spending pretty much all of our time from now on. What you see over here is the main pane where you see the presentation, then you see a Q&A or a question and answer pod over here. Now, from time to time, I'm going to bring in this thing called a short answer pod, which is where, if I need qualitative responses from you, I'm going to seek them over here. So please put those responses in the short answer pod, and I'm just written a hi over here. And if you have questions, you can put those questions in the Q&A pod. This webinar is being recorded, and yes, we will be sharing the recording in the next 12 hours or so. with that, let's go right into the meat of this. And just 1 second, guys. Okay, yes. So let's talk about the agenda for this webinar. So we're going to start with discussing how you approach assumption questions today. Then we will do a very simple pre-thinking exercise. We're going to go through about a couple of arguments to really make sure that you understand the process for pre-thinking. And then from there on, we're going to solve a few full-length questions. And we're going to do them as a quiz. So I'm going to give you the questions first, when you're going to apply the pre-thinking process. And then we're going to apply also the negation test. Why? Because these questions will have answer choices, and applying the negation test will help us understand why a particular answer choice is the correct answer choice. Then we're going to look at, so this is going to be the bulk of the webinar. It's going to be about 80% of this is going to be points 1, 2, and 3. Towards the last 20%, we're going to really say, okay, now that you have a fair idea of what pre-thinking is, you've seen it work on a few questions, how can you make this something which is much more natural to you? Because it does require putting in some effort. So we're going to look at what should you do next? Where should you, what video lessons should you watch? And what questions should you practice? And how should you evaluate your ability to do pre-thinking? Okay, so at a very high level, we're going to document how you prepare today. Then we're going to look at we're going to help you recognize what is important to master assumptions, and then we're going to look at your should-be approach to ACE GMAT critical reasoning. Now, what I really see is there are lots and lots of questions over here where you guys have been asking about general stuff as to when would test centers open, what's a good GMAT score for XYZ business school, and so on and so forth. And we have some really great answers to those. In fact, we have the fourth most active blog in the GMAT and MBA space. But again, usually I answer those questions towards the end of the webinar. So if you have questions that are very specific to your particular case, I request that you put them towards the end. That way I can ask you follow-on questions and give you an answer that is going to be useful for you, and you're going to do something about it. Otherwise, if you can't wait, if you can't till the end of the webinar, you're welcome to write to me at rajat@e-gmat.com. I'm going to just put in my email address over there, and then that way you can write to me, and then I'd get to it in about 24 to 48 hours or so. All right, with that, let's move forward. And let's talk about what is your current approach to critical reasoning. Before we do that, I want to make sure you guys understand what an assumption is, and what pre-thinking is. So pre-thinking is thinking of one potential assumption in your mind in about 15 seconds before you look at the answer choices. And each of the 3 words in quotes is really important because it defines what pre-thinking is. If you take one of them out, you are kind of killing the essence of pre-thinking. And I'm going to just start with the last word over here, which is before. So pre-thinking has to be done before you look at the answer choices. The moment you start looking at answer choices, your mind gets contaminated with the additional information that's out there. And at that point, you can actually throw pre-thinking out of the window. Then let's go to the one potential assumption. An argument can have multiple good assumptions, and our goal is not to come up with all of them, but our goal with pre-thinking is simply to understand the logic that the author uses to arrive at his conclusion, and hence thinking of one potential assumption is good enough. And when you become a skilled pre-thinker, not right now, but when you do become a skilled pre-thinker, you would be able to do this in about 15 seconds. I also want to emphasize on one other thing. Pre-thinking as a term is probably as old as the test itself, but it has been what I call as an abused term, a misunderstood term. And most GMAT experts equate pre-thinking to prediction. That's not what it is. Pre-thinking is not about predicting the answer. And I want to make sure that you guys understand that. Our goal is not to really tell you or not to really figure out what's going to be in the answer choices. Our goal is to understand the logic of the argument, and that understanding has to be very, very clear. There will be questions in which your pre-thought assumption and the assumption in the answer choices would be different, but and that's okay. Why? Because with the essence of pre-thinking is understanding the logic. The moment you see another assumption that fits that logic, you'd be able to identify it and you'd be able to mark it without hesitation. Okay. Now, Pranav says, should we read the argument before we read the prompt? Pranav, there is simple answer doesn't matter. More detailed answer, it probably saves you 10 seconds one way or the other. So for me, it doesn't matter whether you read the argument before you read the question prompt or vice versa. If you read the question prompt, the downside of that is that your brain has to keep more information in its memory. For some people that can become arduous. For others, it doesn't. And so you've got to determine which category you fall in. If you are starting with GMAT verbal is not your strength. I would recommend that you start with reading the argument and then reading the question prompt. Why? Because you want to build that mental capacity. On the other hand, if you feel you already have that mental capacity and reading the prompt first really has very little impact on your ability to comprehend the argument, then read the prompt first. You're going to save 10 seconds overall. So not a huge impact one way or the other. Okay, so let's talk about your current approach, and the question is, how do you solve CR questions? Let me bring in a poll question over here. I'm going to present two methodologies, and I want you to tell me which methodology do you follow. One is read the methodology, go to the answer choices, and do back and forth between the argument and the answer choices till you reach the final candidate. The second is read the argument, do the pre-thinking, and then evaluate the answer choices. I'm going to remove broadcast results so that your responses are not biased. Your response is not biased by what others have posted. All right. 3, 2, and 1. We have about 300 odd students, actually 315 students in the webinar. I would really recommend that more of you put in and participate. Why? Because that's the only way to make the most out of this webinar. All right, let me end the poll, broadcast the results. 56% of you follow methodology 2. Actually, wrong annotation. Follow this methodology, and 44% of you follow methodology 1. Okay, I think I'm going to talk about this part over here. So, even though this webinar is focused on pre-thinking, we're going to focus on three things as a part of pre-thinking. So I'm going to divide this into 3 core skills. One is visualize. So what is visualize? When you read an argument, the conclusion is the most important thing that you need to worry about. And a lot of people, when they read the conclusion, they simply read the conclusion as it's written and don't reword it in their own words. In other words, they don't try and visualize the conclusion. And what we want to do in this argument is build a habit of visualizing the conclusion, which means we're going to say the conclusion in our own words. Sometimes, if the conclusion is complex, we are going to actually maybe take a few cases. And this may seem time consuming to you early on, and it is going to be time consuming early on. But the moment you make it a habit, it's going to become like a subroutine in your mind. And many of you will start doing it automatically. So early on, it might take longer, but once you make it a habit, it's going to happen automatically. The second thing is you're going to also visualize the answer choices. As you guys read an argument, you do the pre-thinking, you come to the answer choices. One of the reasons why people make mistakes is they fail to read the answer choice in isolation. They just read the answer choice applied to the argument without comprehending what the choice is saying. And the way we look at the conclusion is the same way we're going to look at the answer choices. Again, early on, this is going to make you take longer while solving the argument, but If you do this, two things will happen. One is you're going to actually have a much better hit rate. So even for challenging questions, you're going to do much better. The second is this time will go down as you practice more and more. Why? Because again, those subroutines will start to form. The second piece we're going to do is we're going to focus on understanding the logic that the author uses and not go outside the scope of the argument. Why? Because that's the second reason why people make mistakes. They go outside the scope of what the argument's going to what the argument is talking about. And as we take examples, you're going to see that happen with you. The way to prevent that is to focus on just the logic that the author is using. And if you understand the logic, this third piece, which is formulating what we call as a falsification question, which is the essence of pre-thinking, is going to become fairly simple. But for each argument that we work with today, and we're going to work with 6 arguments today, we're going to do all of these 3 things. Okay, with that, let's understand what an assumption is. And to do that, I'm going to give you a very simple argument, an argument that's really close to your heart, something that you guys know inside out, or you probably think about inside out. And here is the argument. And here's a short answer pod. You can put what the author assumes while making his claim in this. All right, I have about 30 responses, 31, 34, 43. Let's get about 50 responses over here. All right, I have 50 responses. Let me now share the results. Okay, really good response rate, 77 responses. That's really good. So, very simple argument. The author gives us a data point, and what is that data point? Joe scored 500 on the GMAT, and then based on this, the author makes a claim, which is that, hey, Joe will not get admission in an Ivy League college. So if you think about the structure of this argument, and I know many of you probably didn't think about it in this analytical fashion. Why? Because this argument's really close to your heart. You absorbed it right away. But on the left-hand side is one data point, on the right-hand side is one claim, and there's this inherent jump between that data point and the claim. And while making that jump, that's kind of where the assumption lies. And what is the assumption? That a score of 500 on the GMAT for someone like Joe is unacceptable to Ivy League colleges. Now, a few things over here. Most of you, I would say 90+% of you got it right. And that's something which is really great. But you have to figure out, why did you get it right? The reason why you got it right is because when you saw this conclusion, you could inherently visualize it. This data point is something that you think about day in and day out, and overall you understood the logic right away. So the point that I want to prove is, if you understand the logic of an argument by visualizing the conclusion and understanding the facts behind it, coming up with assumptions is a very natural exercise. So the reason why you also struggle is because A, you don't visualize the conclusion in a formal fashion, or B, you don't visualize the facts behind it. Okay. Now, there's one thing that I also want to talk about, which many of you didn't focus on, is this part for someone like Joe. And this is something which is really important, and sometimes in critical reasoning questions, especially as they become more challenging, this is an aspect that the test maker will trick you on. Why? Because when the author makes his conclusion, the author rarely states he will not get admission into an Ivy League college. And because the conclusion is just about Joe, the assumption has to be about Joe or someone like him. Why? Because the author is not saying that the Prince of Saudi Arabia will not get admission into an Ivy League college. And that's one thing that I want you to keep in mind. Okay. There was a question over here, and the question was, is this not an inference? Can anyone tell me what is an inference? And or rather, what's the difference between an inference and an assumption? Now, what's the difference between an inference and an assumption? Okay. Assumption is base, all right. So I'm going to just stop this and just to tell you one of the biggest differences. So what you're saying in some sense makes sense, but I want to just clarify this piece. So let me just put in a note spot because I don't have a slide on it. And this is a very important difference to understand. The biggest difference between inference and assumption is the nature of question type or nature of question. So let me just explain my point once again. With an inference, what's being told to you as someone who's a test taker, someone who's attempting the question, take whatever is given to you as true, and then tell me what must be true. And which means that even if in inference questions you generally would not see an argument, generally would always be what would generally be a set of facts. And only in about 5% of the questions would you actually see an argument, which means there's going to be a conclusion. An argument means a conclusion only in about 5% of the questions. But even when you see an argument, you take everything to be true. Now, how does this change for an assumption? Let's kind of look at it. In an assumption, what you're given is always given an argument, which means that you will always have a conclusion. Now, the moment you say that you have an argument, you have a conclusion. And the moment you say you have a conclusion, what you, by implicit, by definition, what you're really saying is a conclusion is something which is always suspect. You can always challenge the conclusion. That's a claim that someone's making. So just from the nature of prompt that's given to you in an inference question, you're not going to challenge the prompt. You're going to assume that is to be true and really say, if that is true, what else must be true? In an assumption, what's given to you is an argument with a conclusion, which is a statement that you have to question. And you have to really say, for that conclusion to be true, what must be true? Which is why you see the must be true part in both of those. But again, the nature of question is very different. Okay. Is that part clear? In one case, you don't question what's given to you. And in the other case, you actually question what's given to you. And that's really important to understand. Okay. And as you solve some questions, you're going to get this. If you did a session on inference versus assumption, we'd probably show you how this would make a difference. So if you were given an argument, or in other words, let's say you were given an argument. Let's say the prompt is an argument. If the prompt is an argument for an inference question, based on this prompt, you shall not challenge the conclusion. For an assumption question, let me just copy paste it. You shall challenge the conclusion. So let me just highlight this. And that's a very big difference between inference and assumption. So prompt, for those of you who are really saying what is the prompt, this entire piece over here is a prompt. This is a prompt. Okay, this thing is a prompt. For an inference question, you will not challenge the prompt. We have to take the prompt as given. By the way, not just conclusion, if there are any other intermediate claims. Okay, and that's something that you're going to really do. Just don't have to worry about it. It's not something that's tested on the test, but for your overall understanding, this is something which is just, if you have a doubt, what is inference, what is an assumption, and what's the difference? That's the difference. Is that clear? Perfect. Okay, let's move forward. So with that, let's understand what an assumption is. Why? Because we are here for an assumption. So what is an assumption? Can you guys define the assumption? What is an assumption? What is an assumption? Let's kind of really get to that. All right, logical bridge between given data and conclusion. Unstated premise must be true. Info used to reach the conclusion. No explicit fact. No implicit. An implicit information not given in the prompt. Let's get a few more responses, but 73 responses. All right, perfect. So I have good answers and I have really great answers. And I'd say about 50% of the answers are really great. 50% of the answers are good, which means they're in the right direction, but they're incomplete. An assumption is an unstated idea that must be true for the conclusion to be valid. Okay, an unstated idea that must be true for the conclusion to be valid. So there are essentially two characteristics of an assumption. One is it provides new information, which means you can't infer it from the argument. And the second is that it must be true for the conclusion to be true, which means without the assumption, the conclusion has the possibility of breaking down. And just to make sure that you understand this must be true part, why? Because that's the part where people struggle with the most. Let's kind of visualize what an argument is like. So if you think of this entire argument as this house with the roof on top and three pillars that are supporting this roof, then your conclusion is this roof. And even though you see three pillars that are supporting this roof, your assumption is and each of these three pillars is premises. The assumption is this essential pillar that is required to keep the roof upright. Without this essential pillar, the roof will cave in or will fall apart. So that's what the assumption is, that essential pillar that is required to keep this roof upright. The other two pillars, which are these two statements, they actually keep the roof stronger, but they are not essential. And that's the difference between an assumption and a premise. A premise is something that makes the conclusion more believable, or in other words, keeps the roof stronger. An assumption is that one statement that is required for the conclusion to be true, or that must be true for the conclusion to remain valid. Okay, and so that essential pillar is an assumption. Now, some of you are really saying, or rather, an assumption can be a fact or a claim. It doesn't matter whether it's a fact or a claim. As long as it's that essential pillar, it's an assumption. Okay. Some of you have been saying stuff such as missing premise, missing link, and so on and so forth. Every assumption is a missing premise or a missing link, but every missing link is not an assumption. Okay, and that's essentially the difference between a strengthener and an assumption. Every missing link is a strengthener, but every missing link is not an assumption. Okay, so then let's talk about what does this must be true mean, just to say that. What must be true means is that if the information provided by assumption is not true, then the conclusion can no longer hold true, or the conclusion can break down. Okay, that's the meaning of must be true. And let's kind of take our prior example and apply this condition to it. So what does falsification of conclusion mean? First of all, let's think about it. When I say the conclusion can be falsified, under what scenario can the conclusion be falsified? Under what condition can the conclusion be falsified? Let's get a few more responses. If Joe gets admission with a score of 500, yes. Yes, if Joe gets admission with a score of 500. So falsification or destroying the conclusion means when Joe gets in with that score of 500. Okay. So then let's kind of think about how do we evaluate whether a particular answer choice is correct. So same argument, the argument's there for you. And we said this is the assumption that we think is the correct assumption. So let's ask ourselves, is it must be true? Or in other words, the question that we are asking is, will Joe get admission, or which is essentially our enumeration of the conclusion breaking down, if the statement to the left no longer holds true? So if this statement over here no longer holds true, then will Joe get admission into an Ivy League college? Now, one thing which I want you to understand is, if a statement no longer holds true, its negated version automatically becomes true. By definition, when you say a statement is not true, what you're also saying, and which is an inference, by the way, since we were talking about inference versus assumption, that its negated version is true. So what it means is when you say a score of 500 on the GMAT for someone like Joe is unacceptable to Ivy League colleges, when you say this statement is not true, what you're also saying is that a score of 500 on the GMAT for someone like Joe is acceptable to Ivy League colleges. Why? Because that's the negated instance. If that becomes true, what happens to our conclusion? Let's ask ourselves, does the conclusion break down? Absolutely. Yes. Why? Because if a score of 500 for someone like Joe becomes acceptable, then the author cannot be 100% certain that Joe will not get admission into an Ivy League college. Because this passes the negation test, this essentially is what the negation test is, we can say this is our correct assumption. Okay. Now, how many of you are confused to really say, how do you say when we say that when a statement is not true, its negated version automatically becomes true? How many of you are confused about this part? So how can you say that? How can you make that claim that when you say a statement is not true, its negated version automatically becomes true? So about 80% of you. And this is something which a lot of people don't understand. They know of it, but they don't explicitly understand. And let's kind of take some examples to do this. Let's take an example. When you say Harvard has the best MBA program, and if you say, hey, that's not true, what you're implicitly saying is that Harvard does not have the best MBA program, or that an MBA program better than or as good as Harvard exists. Is that not true? When you say Harvard, when you say this statement is not true, you're implicitly also making this claim over here, right? And what is this claim? This is nothing but the negated version of that statement. Let's take another example. John runs faster than David. Very simple statement, does a comparison, which, by the way, best is also an implicit comparison. Why? Because it's a superlative degree, and degrees always, comparative and superlative are always comparisons. When you say John runs faster than David, And if you say this statement is not true, what you're implicitly saying is that David is either as fast as John or David is faster than John. Is that not true? That's true, right? That's something which you're implicitly saying again. So the moment you say that a statement is not true, what you're implicitly saying is its negated version is true. All right. So essentially, the thing that you have to really say is if an answer choices must be true, then the conclusion will break down in the presence of that negated version of that particular answer choice. And then this comes from the very definition of assumption, which is an assumption is an unstated idea that must be true for the conclusion to remain valid. By the way, if you understand this definition, that's all that you need to know to answer any assumption question. And and that's basically it. This is a lot of critical reasoning is like Newton's laws of motion. If you know them, you can pretty much, build any structure in the world. Okay, let's go to must be true part 2. If the answer choice is not must be true, which means it's the incorrect answer choice, which is what confuses you, then the conclusion will not break down in the presence of the negated instance of that answer choice. Let's kind of look at this part over here, and we'll take the same example, same argument, but a different answer choice. Again, same argument, we did that. Let's look at an answer choice. An answer choice is a score of 500 on the GMAT is not a good score. This is an answer choice that is given to you, and you're asked, is this the correct assumption? So the answer choice that you need to evaluate is that the score of 500 on the GMAT is not a good score. And you say, okay, is that must be true? Again, the same process, which means will the conclusion break down if the statement to the left no longer holds true? Let's kind of figure it out. If this statement no longer holds true, its negated instance holds true, which means a score of 500 on the GMAT becomes a good score. If it becomes a good score, then does Joe get admission into an Ivy League college if that score is considered to be good? Absolutely not. Why? Because when you think of the argument, it's not dependent on whether this score is considered to be a good score or a bad score. You could easily replace 500 with 700, and the logic of the argument would not change. So because the logic isn't predicated on how you qualify this particular score of 500, so this particular answer choice is not a correct assumption based on our analysis. Now, many of you are thinking, saying, hey, I could have figured it out on my own without going through this elaborate process. And yes, you could have, but as questions get more difficult, you're going to find going through this process becomes a lot easier, becomes very helpful. So let's start to apply this on every question that we solve, because in about 5 to 7 minutes, you're going to need this. Okay. So at a very high level, what's our takeaway over here? If you understand this must be true, for the correct answer choice, the conclusion will break down or will be invalidated when you negate this answer choice. For the incorrect answer choice, the conclusion will continue to hold true when you negate this particular answer choice. All right. With that, let's do a small pre-thinking exercise. What I'm going to do over here is I'm going to give you an argument which is slightly more complex than the one that we looked at. And I'm going to give you about 3 minutes, not just 2, but 3 minutes. So you're going to get a pure argument, no answer choices. And you're going to put in your pre-thinking, and we're going to record your answers in a short answer poll. Then we're going to go about my way of doing pre-thinking, and this is where we introduce the falsification question. And to do this, we're also going to learn and revise some theory. Okay, and then you evaluate submissions. And let's see this question, Bhavya. The assumption that we gave in, then the assumption that you're stating, they're essentially rewords of one another. So yes. Okay. Just clear all answers over here. So We'll do 2 to 3 submissions over here. Now, I want to ask this one other question over here, which is, how many of you have connected to this webinar using a mobile broadband? And let me just put in. Okay, or which is also called a dongle, and in certain parts of the world, or so how many of you have connected to the internet either through mobile broadband or through an actual fiber or DSL based internet connection? Let's get those responses in. I have about 280 people in the webinar. So let's get about 150 responses. That will give us a statistically significant number. 3, 2, and 1. Let me end the poll and broadcast the results. So about 33% of you have connected using a mobile broadband. Now, a mobile broadband, as with the nature of the technology, and as a former mobile researcher, I kind of know the technology inside out, is not supposed to be designed for real-time communications, especially consistently long real-time communications, which involve data. For voice, yes, but not for data. And so during this webinar, there may be times where you may find that the audio has a certain lag if you're using a mobile broadband. If you're using an actual cable or a fiber internet, you shouldn't have any problem. Even if your connection is like 128 kbps, audio should come through loud and clear. Why? Because um, the actual cable or fiber or DSL internet connections are designed to maintain a certain service level agreement or an SLA. So yes, if you're using a mobile dongle, my apologies to you if your experience is not ideal. But unfortunately, it's the nature of that connection, and our goal really is to provide the best education or best learning experience possible, and which is why we use Adobe Connect. But Adobe Connect requires that you have a connection which is a bit more SLA oriented. It doesn't require super high speeds, but it requires that your connection be consistent. And that's how you get all of these polls. That's how I can bring in like 3 polls here on the screen. Each of these connects to your computer. But if you don't have an SL oriented connection, you probably won't see the results in time, or you would at times experience choppy audio. If that does happen, what I would recommend is join again. If it continues to happen again, then in that case, watch the recording, because the recording would be perfect. Okay, with that, let's kind of go over here and talk about some best practices. One is that read the argument slowly and make sure you A, understand and visualize the conclusion, and B, understand how the author, the logic that the author uses to arrive at the conclusion. Okay. Not all of you are going to get this right. And the reason why you're going to falter is because you're not used to reading slowly. You're not used to, to, to reading the conclusion, stopping at that point and asking yourself, hey, what did I just read? Can I reword it in my own words? And you keep worrying about timing. You're going to really say, okay, it's been a minute. What is my assumption? It's been a minute and 30 seconds. What is my assumption? Rather than asking the right question over here. And if you worry, you're going to find that your brain's going haywire. It's going to go in all sort of directions. And you're going to come up with assumptions that are not great answers. But again, if that happens, don't worry, we'll help you get there. These are symptoms that indicate the problems you have, and these problems are very solvable. Okay, with that, let's solve our second argument, which is our first main argument of the day. Make sure you have a pen and paper ready so that you can solve the argument. And here is the argument. And I'm going to share a short answer poll over here where you can put in your assumption. You've got to put in what does the author assume. And remember, I'm going to give you about 3 minutes, so don't rush through this. You're going to have ample time to solve this. All right, let's get those answers in last 30 seconds. All right, 3, 2, and 1. Let's get those responses, guys. You are here in this webinar. I only have 34 responses. Let me broadcast the results overall so you guys can really see. Okay, I've got some good answers. Uh, let's look at those, and I have a lot of answers that that actually beat around the bush, but some really good answers. So that's good. I'm really happy to see that a few of you, but 15 to 20% of you've gotten the gist of it. Now let's move forward and let's see how would I go about approaching this question. The first thing I want you to tell me is which statement is the main conclusion. And I'm going to put in a poll over here. Now in this poll, there are 4 options. I use this poll for another question as well. So that's why I have this, but you focus on only statement 1, 2, and 3. So I'm going to go here. Let's kind of move forward over here. Which statement is the main conclusion? Please ignore statement 4. Don't choose statement 4. It's not an option here. Which statement is the main conclusion? 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Let's get a few more responses, guys. I have 140 responses over here. Okay. Let me end the poll, broadcast the results. And when you see this over here, what you clearly see is where people, first place where people start to falter. Only 40% of you chose statement 2 as the main conclusion, which is actually the correct answer. But others thought either statement 1 is the main conclusion or statement 3 is the main conclusion. What's the definition of the main conclusion? What's the definition of the main conclusion? A main conclusion is a statement that the author wants you to believe. Think of the main conclusion as his agenda for the argument. And when you think about this argument, what the author wants you to believe is statement 2, where he's saying the difference between professors in the tenure system and other full-time lecturers has to do with the reward system. So what he's really saying is it's the reward system that's causing this difference between these two entities, which is professors in the tenure system and other full-time lecturers. That's what he wants you to believe. Okay. Now, a lot of people think that statement 1 is the main conclusion. Why? Because you have this word concludes over here. Now, the thing to note over here is that the main conclusion always belongs to the author, okay, not to another entity. And hence, when you say a research paper published, this is not what the author is trying to say. The author is taking this information and then arriving at the main conclusion based on that. Okay, so this is what the author is trying to say. Statement 3 is a supporting statement, which is written to make you believe the main conclusion. And statement 1 is the context. It's a data point that the author uses to arrive at the main conclusion. And because the author uses this in fact is a strengthener as well, or it's a premise, which means a statement which supports the main conclusion. This is what we call as argument structure, the structure of an argument. Is the argument structure clear? All right. That is good. Now, let's kind of go back. We now have to come up with what an assumption is. Okay. Now, to do that, let's kind of revisit. What's the definition of an assumption? What is the definition of an assumption? An unstated idea that must be true for the conclusion to hold true. Okay. Unstated idea that must be true for the conclusion to hold true. Okay, it's not a bridge, not, I mean, every assumption is a bridge, but every bridge is not an assumption. I just want to make sure that part is clear. An assumption is an unstated idea that must be true for the conclusion to remain valid. If an assumption is an unstated idea that must be true, then an assumption, without an assumption, your conclusion will break down. Why? Because otherwise it's not a must be true condition, which means that an assumption has to be built around those scenarios in which the conclusion breaks down. I mean, if you think about that roof, the house and the roof example that I gave, if you were to place an essential pillar, you would place an essential pillar where the roof starts to cave in. You know, that's kind of the definition of an essential pillar. So to figure out an assumption, we need to figure out those scenarios in which the conclusion breaks down. Read this statement once again and read this entire slide once again and tell me, does that make sense to you? If by definition the assumption is that must be true statement, then it has to be built around the scenarios where the conclusion starts to break down. Right? And so if we have to figure out what an assumption should be, let's figure out where does the conclusion break down. If we figure out where the conclusion breaks down, then we should be able to figure out what an assumption is. So how do we figure out where the conclusion breaks down? We ask this question: under what circumstances, given the facts in the argument, will my conclusion break down? Okay, that's the question that we ask. And then once we get those circumstances, my assumption is that such circumstances are impossible or are not allowed. So let's kind of go about doing this on this particular argument. We already went through this. So let's ask this question. This is formulating the pre-thinking question, the second core skill. Okay. Under what circumstances would the reward system not be responsible for the difference in performance, given that full-time lecturers, we know that full-time lecturers enhance student learning more than professors do. And the other thing that we know is the reward system for professors places greater emphasis, and greater is a comparative word. Always be very careful about comparative words on critical reasoning, on research than on teaching. Okay. So this is what we need to worry about. Now, look at the generic form of falsification question, which is over here. And now look at the specific implementation of that falsification question over here. And then tell me, does this make sense to you? Because how you formulate this is the key. This is the pre-thinking method, by the way. If you get this, you have the pre-thinking method. And for those of you who are saying no, if you can put your question in the Q&A pod, that would be great. As to why is it that that you're saying no. So read this over here. Or rather, wait for a few more seconds and let's kind of implement this. Okay. So the question to ask is, under what condition will the reward system not cause a difference in performance between tenured and non-tenured? And why are we focusing on the reward system? Because let's get my conclusion over here. Let's get my argument. The argument, the author is blaming the reward system for the difference. Okay. The author is blaming the reward system for the difference. Here is the argument. Statement 1, statement 2, statement 3 have been separated out over here. So what we have to question is, under what condition can we not blame the reward system, given that for tenured professors, the reward system places greater emphasis on research? Okay. What are some of the possible scenarios in which we cannot blame the reward system? let's kind of think about them. Okay. If non-tenured faculty has an identical reward system, then we can't blame the reward system for the difference. Remember, the author is not questioning the difference and impact that they make. The author is questioning whether you can blame the reward system, or the author is saying it's the reward system that's causing the difference. So if non-tenured and tenured both have an identical reward system, then you can't blame the reward system. Look at this and tell me, is this clear? If non-tenured and tenured have an identical reward system, then you can't blame the reward system, right? The other thing is, if tenured professors don't act as per the reward system, you can give someone a reward system, but if people don't care about it, then you can't blame the reward system for the outcome for a certain outcome, right? If people don't care about it. For the second condition, both of these scenarios actually, they really say it has to be something else, not the reward system, that's causing the difference. Look at them. So if these are the scenarios under which my conclusion breaks down, then what's my assumption? My assumption is that non-tenured professors do not have an identical reward system. And then the second assumption is most tenured professors should care about the reward system. Okay, those are my assumptions. There could be a few others as well, but those are the core assumptions. Now, are these assumptions very different from the assumptions that you'd come up with in your pre-thinking? Let's get a yes, no. Okay, they're very different, right? But for many of you, they are over here. And if they are not, then congratulations, you guys are doing really well. Now, think of it. Is these assumptions, coming up with these assumptions, if you follow the process, is that rocket science? Was any of this rocket science? No. If you follow the process, this was a natural outcome over here. And that's something that I want you to believe. Why? Because we're going to do a couple of more questions using this, and then we're going to go towards uber difficult question. And yes, identifying the conclusion and understanding the conclusion is important. And we have someone from Germany who says 9 over here. I love German, by the way. V2. V2 is a German rocket that they built during World War II, by the way. Towards the end of it, though. So the thing that I want you to make sure you understand is if you formulate that pre-thinking question methodically, you come up with those falsification scenarios. When you come up with those falsification scenarios, you're golden. All right. So I'm going to give you one other question over here, and then, but I think actually before that, let's just do this. How many of you are worried about timing? How many of you are saying, man, this is going to take very long? How many of you are worried about this? 90% of you. Okay. Or 80% of you. That's good. I like those odds to begin with. So here's something that I want you to tell you. This is how you're going to feel. So let's say you're someone who's starting pre-thinking with point number 1 over here. Okay. And then where your accuracy to answer questions is low and your time to answer questions is medium. And this is again all on comparative scale. I have about 300 people in the webinar right now. So for this point number 1 is going to be slightly different for each one of you. But this journey that I'm going to talk about is going to be the same for you guys. So the moment you start using pre-thinking, 2 things will happen. 1, you're going to take longer to answer questions. 2, you're going to actually get more questions right. And you're going to ask yourself why, because people worry more about timing. They really say, hey, why the hell am I doing this pre-thinking? Why? Because I'm already worried about timing on the test, even though I've just started studying for it. And as Pranav says, I'm a slow test taker in general. Actually, slow test takers do really well on the test. This is a test designed for you guys. If you continue to do pre-thinking, what's going to happen is you're going to go from point 2 to point 3, where your time to answer questions is going to go down. You can really see the time goes higher over here as you go further along the x-axis. And your accuracy will continue to go up. So your hit rate is going to be higher. And you're going to tell yourself, now I understand why pre-thinking is so great, and what the benefit of pre-thinking is. And as you continue to do that, you're going to continue to improve. Your average time to answer CR questions is going to go down. Okay. Now, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, the number of questions that it takes depends on how diligent you are as you go from 1 to 2 and 2 to 3. Tip for people who spend analyzing about 6 to 8 minutes per question would go from 1 to 3 in about 15 arguments. For people who don't analyze, when they make a mistake or when they're unable to do pre-thinking, why they're unable to do pre-thinking, you'd end up wasting 100 arguments and you'd still not be able to go from 1 to 3. So the more time you spend analyzing every question, the faster you get to point 3. Now we have some e-GMAT students over here. I want to kind of figure out, is anyone here in level 3? Has anyone this is level 3, by the way. Has anyone experienced this level 3? I know we are very, very early in our CR thing, but has anyone experienced level 3 or level 2 over here if you are a paid student? And what you really see is, already 16 to 18% of the students have experienced level 3. Okay. Level 2, once you start using pre-thinking, you will experience level 2. That's but again, those 17% or so, those 9-10 of those students, that is where things start to become easier. And for those of you who experienced level 3, who've seen that reduction in time, how does that feel when you see this? Level 3 is when you start getting way higher hit rate while spending less time on an average. How does this feel for those of you who are in level 3 over here? Okay, if you can put your answers in the short answer pod. Eureka! It is a eureka moment overall, and that's something which is what you should strive. Okay, so let's kind of go forward. So overall, it's a process that you have to go through. And the key to doing this is analyzing each question. Spend 10, 12 minutes when you're unable to do pre-thinking on the question while on the solution that we give to you. And here are some people who've done this. So here's a statement by a guy who really says, he says, understand the passage completely most important. Take your time, equally important, pre-think and answer before looking at the answer choice. Probably this one word will have the most impact on your GMAT score. Is a guy who scored 740. Another very recent student, he says, answer CR questions as if there are no answer choices. Pre-thinking is a game changer. So this particular student went from 35th percentile in pre-thinking to 97th percentile in about 12 days. That helped him go from a 700 to a 770. He says, when it gets to 700 plus level CR questions, you have to do pre-thinking. The reason to do pre-thinking is to help you focus on the logic and not deviate from the key argument when trap and out of scope answer choices show up. Okay. And then there's another one. He says, this pre-thinking primes the mind and we are constantly on our toes while reading an RC passage or a CR question stem. Apart from comprehending the passage, we keep speculating that in which direction the passage will orient or what logical jump has the author taken. And again, when you get the PDF, you can click on these links to get there. Now with that, let's go on to our third argument for the day. And now we are going to move forward really quickly. We're going to do 4 more arguments after this. So here is your poll over here. And this question, focus on doing pre-thinking, focus on understanding the author's logic overall. And then you're going to find that the answer becomes very apparent. Okay, guys, last 30 seconds, get those answers in. Five, four, three, two, and one. We end the poll, broadcast the results. What you can really see is choices B and E, really popular. And the other choices are also respectively. I wouldn't say many of you've chosen choices. If I combine choices C, D, and A, or A, C, and D, that's still about 27% of the audience. Now, how many of you found the answer choices uber confusing? How many of you said, man, the answer choices are super confusing? They're very similar, okay? And so there's no way to really say which one's the correct answer, which one is not. Some of you find B and E confusing, some of you find C and E confusing, okay? And this is where you start to see the benefit of pre-thinking, all right? So and once we do pre-thinking, you're gonna find, barring the correct answer, every other answer choice is incorrect. It's not that one is better than the other. Every other answer choice is incorrect, and which is why you start to do pre-thinking. So what's the commissioner's claim over here? What's the commissioner's claim? Let's start to visualize the conclusion. This is 700 level. I mean, the stats show any question that has accuracy of 50% or lower is 700 level. So what's the claim? I want you to visualize that the revenue will go up by 50%. Essentially, the moment you read this, what I'm really saying is, okay, if last year we made $1 million, this year we're going to make $1.5 million or $1.6 million or $1.7 million. Why? Because I see the word at least 50%. So at a bare minimum, it will be 50%. When you think about this argument, right? It's a very simple argument, right? Super simple. There's nothing complex about this. This is a scenario that you can easily visualize if you want to. So, and even for an argument as simple as this, we can make this confusing. So, it becomes the author's conclusion when you look at the question stem. Okay. So how do we estimate annual revenue? How do we estimate annual revenue? What's the formula? Given this, revenue is not profit minus cost. That's okay, there's nothing called profit minus cost. You can really see, even just to do something this simple, you have so many different responses. Price times quantity is good. Okay, a better response is price per mile multiplied by the total number of toll miles. Okay, annual revenue is toll per mile multiplied by total number of toll miles. Is that clear? Okay. All right. Now, one other thing, and I'm going to do this again and again while solving this. What's my definition of assumption? What's the fundamental definition of assumption? What's my fundamental definition of assumption? An unstated idea that must be true for the conclusion to remain valid, right? Okay, so that is good. So let's kind of move forward. So how do we estimate annual revenue? It's toll per mile into total number of toll miles. Now, what's given to us? What's given to us is that the toll per mile is already up by 50%. That's something that's we're gonna do. This is plus 50%. That's given to us. So the question to ask is, under what circumstances would the annual revenue not increase by 50% provided that the toll per mile has been increased by 50%? So what's the only condition under which this annual revenue will not go up at least by 50%? If the total number of toll miles uh, reduce, right? If the toll miles reduce, the only condition is the total number of miles decreases. If that number decreases, then that's going to happen. Can everyone see this? Really simple logic. It's a product of two numbers. One's already up by 50%. So the only way that the total won't be up by at least 50% is if the other number goes down. Okay. So my assumption is that the total number of miles driven does not decrease. I want you to hone on this assumption. Okay. I want you to hone on this assumption. How do you determine these types of formulas? The argument gives you that, right? You don't even have to determine. If you look at the argument, and that's where reading the argument is really important over here, the argument tells you that in many ways. Okay, where you're given a toll per mile and you're given a total revenue. If toll per mile is 10 cents, then hey, what's the total amount of revenue? If you're being paid per mile, then the total number of miles multiplied by 10 cents. You're given that in the argument. Okay. Now, which answer choice talks about the total number of miles over here? Read the answer choices. It's choice E, which is my correct answer. That is my correct answer. And I'm going to talk about choices B, A, B, C, D as well as to really say why are they not correct answers. So let's kind of talk about choice B, which was really popular. Okay, this was choice B. Many of you chose choice B. Choice B says the total number of trips made in the toll highway will not decrease from its current level. And then we're going to really say, hey, is this a must be true? Remember the analysis that we did earlier? Is this a must be true? If this choice is true, does it mean that the total number of toll miles travel, total number of miles traveled on toll roads will decrease? What do you guys think? If the total number of trips goes down, will the total number of miles definitely go down? Not really. Not really. Why? Why? Because if the number of miles per trip increases, then that need not be the case. If let's say last year we had 1,000 trips, now we have 900 trips, but on each trip we travel 50% longer, then my total number of miles would still be the same or more. Okay, so then is choice B a must be true? Is choice B a must be true? No, it isn't, which is why this is not your correct answer. The question to ask is this a must be true? And that's where the fundamental definition of assumption, and that's where pre-thinking is really important. And that's where understanding author's logic is really important. Now, the same reason, you can apply the same logic to the average length of trip. If the average length of trip decreases, does it mean that the total number of miles will go down? If the average length of trip decreases, no. Why? Because you could now make more trips. So again, is this a must be true? No, it isn't a must be true. And similarly, choice C, the number of drivers who avoid highways, will not increase, not a must be true. Why? Because even if that happens, the length of trip could go up. Okay. So again, you can now see the value of pre-thinking. Why? Because it crystallizes that logic for you. And it then forces you to really think in the direction that the author is thinking about. And that's the beauty of asking that falsification question before looking at the answer choices. Now, I'm going to try an experiment. This is a question that I just created today as a fun question before we go on to a few other questions. And I want you, so that as I don't have it in on PowerPoint, I have this question in a Word doc over here. And I want you to really apply what you learned in this argument, which is how do you focus on the conclusion to this. Here is my argument over here. And it's a very, very simple question. Okay, for those of you who really say option A, the amount of money required over here has no relevance in the context of the conclusion. The conclusion is purely about the increase in annual revenue. It has nothing to do with how much money you need. Okay, so here is my question over here. And again, remember, I just created it this morning, and I'm going to give you the answer choices. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to answer this question. Okay, another 30 seconds, guys, or another 15 seconds, since I have most of the responses. Three, two, and one. And I'm really happy to see how well you've done on this question. A very simple question, but the answer choices were confusing. And I'm really happy that very few of you have chosen choice A or choice B. And you've just focused on the overall logic of the argument that for the first 90 days, the first 90 days, the death toll in the first 90 days is a reliable indicator of the overall death toll that a pandemic is likely to cause. So that's something which is just really good. I see that you guys are getting it. So now we are now going to go towards some uber difficult questions. That is great. So and again, I didn't want to discuss this. This was purely to reinforce this. So we're going to solve two questions. And the way we do this is I'm going to give you a poll over here. And in this poll, I'm Because these are difficult questions, I don't want to time you. I want you to time yourself. So I want you to select not answered. I want about 100 people to select not answered. So that way, when you choose another answer choice other than not answered, I know that uh, that you've chosen an answer choice. So I have 62, 64, 65, 66. Let's get 80 people to solve not answered. Okay, I have 80 people to say not answered. Here is your first question. All right, guys, about 40% of you are done. All right, 80% of the class is done. Let's get those responses in now in the next 10 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Let me end the poll. I'm going to broadcast the results, and you can really see choice A was popular, B is popular, D is popular. So we're going to discuss these choices. But before that, we're going to solve one more question. So again, you guys know the deal. Let's select not answered. Let's get 80 people to say not answered. Good. And here is your next question. Okay, guys, 60. Okay, last 10 seconds, 80% of the class is done. 3, 2, and 1. Let me end the poll and broadcast the results. So again, 41% of you chose choice D, which is a clear winner, but choices E and C, as well as choice A, all three of them are also quite popular. So let's look at this. How were these questions? How did they feel? They're both official questions, by the way. How did these questions feel? Tough, bazooka, yes. They were tough. They're the toughest questions that you're likely to see over there. And the reason why I have these questions is to really prove to you, if you follow the process and not get swayed by the language of the question, you're going to find that pre-thinking can help you solve the most challenging questions easily. So both of them are 700 plus or 750 level questions overall. So let's kind of go about doing them. The first one was hard. Both first and second were hard. And even those of you who've gotten them right, want to make sure you get them right for the right reasons. So what are the three skills that we said we're going to really focus on in this webinar? The first one was to visualize the conclusion. The second one was to understand the logic of the argument, and the third one was to formulate the falsification question, which is kind of the pre-thinking method. Visualize, understand, formulate. And this question, if you do three of them right, because it tests you to the extreme on each of those three skills, you're going to find that answering this question becomes really easy. And I'm going to do this for you. And once I do this for you, you're going to tell me what the answer is. Okay, so let's move forward over here. So what's the conclusion? Let's visualize this. What is the conclusion? The number of landers receiving special program information did not increase a whole lot during this time. Okay, everyone agrees with the conclusion? Okay, so let's visualize this conclusion, and I want you to really do this in your own words. So what this is really saying is that if in 1994 1,000 people received special programs, SPI, or special program information, then in 1996 the number is between 990 and 1010, or you could say 900 and 1100, doesn't matter. But essentially you need to form a visual in your brain to be able to answer this, and that formulation of that visual is really important. How many of you actually kind of did some of this? If in 1994 1,000 people received special program information, then in 1996 that number is between this. And this, by the way, if you want to add a bit more context to it, you'd say regardless of the population. The overall population could be 1 million or 10 million or 1K. It could be one of those. Okay, that's something you need to do this. That vision in your brain, that visual in your brain should form. It's really important. You're going to find your hit rate will go up tremendously if you do this. Okay, let's see, why does the author really say that? Because this is what the author is trying to assert. So outside of Verland doesn't matter. Why? Because the question is about the number of Verlanders. It's not about the total number of people. The subject over here is the number of Verlanders. Okay. So there are two reasons why the author says this. One is the number of RDS equipped radios, which is the right kind of radios that can receive special program information, remain almost similar. And the second is that the number of transmitting stations, that number went up from 250 to 600. Okay. Now, because you see a however between them, and you know that statement number 3 supports the conclusion, and statement number 2 and 3 go against one another, which means statement number 2 kind of goes against the conclusion. Okay. And then the first statement talks about context, and it says, hey, if you want to receive special program information, then you need two things. One is you need a radio station with RDS technology, and then you need a radio with an RDS feature. So you need both. You need the RDS thing at both ends. Is the argument clear to you guys? Or is it clear now? Right? Very simple argument, essentially, if you think about it. The answer choice is a very different thing, but very, very simple argument. Now, what's the logical structure? Logical structure always starts with a conclusion. It says before 94 and 96, between 94 and 96, very few additional Verlanders received RDS programs. Okay. Between 94 and 96, two things happened. One is the number of receiving radios remained the same. The second is the number of transmitting stations increased tremendously. The context is to receive RDS programming, you need RDS radius. And you combine both of them, you reach this conclusion. All right. Okay. Now, let's kind of go and ask our falsification question. Our falsification question is going to be, under what conditions will there be a significant addition? Remember the word significant addition. We are trying to falsify very few additional Verlanders. So we're going to really change that to significant addition to the number of people receiving special programming, given that the number of radios remain the same and we have a lot more transmitting stations. So is this falsification question clear? Under what conditions will we have a significant addition? And I see some scenarios right now. Most of you, it's clear. To those of you it's not clear, you can put a question in the Q&A pod. What are the various falsification scenarios? For those of you, this is clear. Under what scenario will there be a significant addition despite the same number of receiving radios? Under what scenario will there be a significant addition? Can you guys tell me? Area in which the radio signals reached increased. Yes, good. The one possible scenario is that if the coverage goes up, which is what guest said, okay, which is if additional stations now cover areas where the people had the right kind of radio, but there was no coverage earlier. Why? Because we have a whole lot of more transmitting stations. The other is if people per radio goes up. If you start putting these radios in Starbucks, then instead of putting them in people's houses, then yes, more people will receive RDS programming, right? Okay. Both of these are scenarios in which my conclusion breaks down. These are what we call as falsification scenarios. If that is the case, then my assumptions are that new stations don't increase coverage or people per radio remain about the same. How many of you get the assumptions? Simple, right? There's not a whole lot in here. When you follow the process, things seem to jump at you. You guys came up with the second one as well as the first one. I didn't really tell you. I had them written out. I thought about them, but you guys could think of them independently. Okay. And for those of you who are saying no, please put in your question. If you have a doubt, put in your question. Otherwise you're not going to learn. Okay. So can you guys see that pre-thinking gets these things out fairly easily? When you ask this question, you're able to come up with these scenarios. And once you have those scenarios, you do that. How do you arrive at falsification scenarios? By asking this question. Okay, I like how people are answering questions. What is plus, negative, positive? It's positive and negative. Okay, it's negative and positive, but yeah, I think you get it. So what's the second scenario? I'm going to explain the second scenario. If people per radio go up, so in a family, only one guy was listening to a radio now because the radio is in the house. There are all 4 or all 5 people start listening to radio in 1996. Okay, so that's what's people per radio. Or in other words, you could also really say if these radios, let's say you had 1,000 radios earlier, and each one of them were in various houses. Now 500 of them are sold to various Starbucks, so people per radio goes up either way. Okay, does that help answer what's the second condition? Could there be another device that uses RDS technology? No. What kind of RDS are we talking about? Radios, or are we talking about cell phones here? What are we talking about? Radios or cell phones in the context of this argument? Radios, right? So don't think about other devices. Similarly, are we talking about Verlanders or total people? We're talking just about Verlanders. So don't think about people who are outside of Verland. Okay. Again, that's the beauty of pre-thinking. It forces you to ask this falsification question in the context of the argument. GMAT critical reasoning is a test of logic. It's not a test of imagination. It's a test of logic. Okay. And that's why I say it's not rocket science. Because to imagine starts to get into the realm of rocket science. Because this is the most challenging question that you're going to see in critical reasoning, yet the logic is fairly simple. Okay, so let's look at answer choice analysis. The first choice, very it's not worded in simple form. It's very complex, and let's kind of move this over here. I'm going to show you how you guys polled for this particular question. Here's how you polled. 21% of you chose choice A. Choice A is my correct answer, by the way. Choice A says few, if any, okay, of RDS equipped RDS radio stations. So few, if any, is almost none of RDS radio stations that began broadcasting after 94. So which are the RDS stations that began broadcasting after 94? Those are the new radio stations. Broadcast to people with RDS equipped radios living in areas not previously reached by RDS stations. So who are the people who have the RDS radios but were living in areas not previously reached? That is what we call this. That's increasing the coverage of RDS programming. Why? Because what it's saying is almost none of the new stations are put in areas where people had the right kind of radio, but were not covered earlier. Okay, so this is in line with our pre-thinking one. New radios don't increase coverage. If you really want to falsify this or you negate this, you really say at least some radio stations increase coverage. Now, if some radio stations increase coverage, what happens? Your conclusion breaks down. Why? Because if some radio stations increase coverage, then the author cannot say with 100% certainty that the newly added radio stations do not add. The number of Verlanders after the newly added radio stations did not go up, or number of Verlanders receiving special programming did not go up in 1996. First of all, is this clear? Let me just put in a yes no poll. I think a yes no poll is much better. Let's put in a generic yes no. Just give a second. Read this while I bring in my poll. Is this clear? And for those of you who are saying, no, it's not clear, which aspect is not clear? But 70% of you get it. The other 30 odd percent, what part is not clear? Can you put your question over here? If the new radio stations go in areas where people had the right kind of radio but zero coverage, now what aspect in this answer choice is not clear? It is very wordy, yes. And which is where I said the third skill is, or which also is the first skill is to visualize what the answer choice is saying. Yes, few increases still possible. And what is my argument over here? Let's bring in my notes pane. What is my argument? My argument says did not increase significantly. Okay, you did not come up with a falsification, but you can really see. All right, good. Understanding the sentence. And again, these are skills that you build along with this. Let me just talk about few if any. Some of you have been saying about few if any over here. Let's kind of look at this. So if I say few, if any, stocks went up today, what am I saying? What is this statement saying? Is this statement not saying almost no stocks went up today? Am I not saying the same thing? Almost none or almost no, or almost none of the stocks. Right? And that's kind of where you understand, you build these snippets. And when I talked about subroutines early on, these are the subroutines that you build. If you are looking at solutions, if you are focused on understanding why you made a mistake. So for those of you who are really saying, can you go to the logical structure? Yes, here it is. Here is my falsification question. I'm going to clear this out over here. Here is the previous slide. Now I've removed the animations. Let's look at the falsification question once again. Under what conditions will there be a significant addition to the number of people receiving RDS programming, given that there are a lot more stations and despite very few additional radios? Okay, so what are the possible scenarios? If the additional stations now cover areas where there was no coverage earlier, okay, and if more people start listening to the radio. So my assumptions are new stations don't improve coverage and people per radio remain about the same. And my correct answer is this assumption. Let's look at the question. Though I got the right answer. Question level 700 level. I mean, I've said that like 4 to 5 times. The 750 level, if there can be. This is the most challenging question you're going to really see. But again, logic, simple. The receiving stations cannot be same as the old ones. Why? Because these are stations that began broadcasting after 94. Oh, the receiving means receiving are not stations, they're radios, just to make sure. I'm going to analyze every answer choice. Don't worry about it. Let's go to choice B. Choice B was very popular too. I'm going to analyze every answer choice. But I want you to understand why choice A is correct first. And if you want to see the argument, here is the argument. Okay. Here, I'm going to share the argument with you. Here is the argument. You can scroll up and down. Okay. Choice B says, in 1996, most worldlanders who lived within the listening area of an RDS station already have a radio equipped to receive RDS. Now, once again, what's the definition of an assumption, guys? What's the definition of an assumption? An unstated idea that must be true for the conclusion to hold valid, right? So let's understand what choice B is saying at a very high level. Okay. It's saying that if you lived within a covered area, you had the right kind of radio. When you say most, I'm taking most to an extreme, and I'm saying 100%. Now, what is my conclusion? My conclusion is that, hey, the number of worldlanders who received this special program did not go up. So essentially, what my conclusion is saying is if 20% of people received special programming in 1994, in 1996 also that number is 20% more or less, assuming the population didn't go up, but let's assume that. So that's what my assumption is saying. That's what my conclusion is saying. Can everyone visualize this? Remember, I asked you to visualize the conclusion early on. If 20% of the people received special programming in 94, in 96, it's also 20%. Now, tell me, for that conclusion to hold true, is it required? Is that a must be true that most worldlanders who had a who had an RDS radio in 1994 should also have an RDS radio in 1996? No. No, it's not required. So does it satisfy the must be true condition? No, it doesn't satisfy the must be true condition. And if you apply the same logic, Amanda, you would realize that if we had 1994 instead of 1996, that would also be wrong as per the same logic. Okay, why? Because the conclusion is about the change in number of people from 94 to 96 and not about the final state or the initial state. Okay, either way, it would not be a must be true condition. So understand what the conclusion is saying. The conclusion is saying the number of world landers, and I'm going to bold it up over here, receiving did not increase significantly, which means it did not go up significantly. Okay, it's about the delta. And for the delta to not change, it is not required that a certain percentage of people have RDS radios. That number could be 1%, 5%, 10%, 50%, 80%. The argument will continue to hold. In the same way as in the first argument, that score of 500, the number 500 didn't matter when it came to admission to Ivy League college. What mattered was the logic. It was built on the number. In the same way, the number here doesn't matter. What matters is that it shouldn't change between 94 and 96. We care about the change, not the absolute numbers. And that's why you need to learn how to visualize A, the conclusion, B, the answer choices. Aniket says if all the population already had this. Yes, Aniket, you're right, but is that required? Let me just give you a parallel example, Aniket. Let's just give you a parallel example. So if I give you a statement, everyone who scored 800 got into Harvard. Would you conclude that to get into Harvard, it is required to score 800? Would you conclude that? No, you won't. Why not? Why? Because some people, the answer is no, because the statement is not saying this is not equal to only people who scored 800 got into Harvard. Okay? That's why. No, it's not some other factors. It's not saying only people who scored 800 got into Harvard. Maybe Harvard, for example, takes in 1,000 students. Okay, now 100 of them scored 800, applied, and got into Harvard. But the other 900 scored less than 800 and still got into Harvard, right? Right? So you can't really say that to get into Harvard, it is required to score 800. Why? Because the other 900 still got into Harvard with a score of 750 or even a 700. So if a condition satisfies the conclusion, it doesn't make it a must be true. Remember this. As a general principle. Keep things simple. Understand must be true. Okay. And this is where just in one question you can learn so much. Equipping a radio station with RDS technology does not decrease the station's listening area. Okay. What kind of programming are we concerned about in my conclusion? and you have the conclusion right over there. What kind of programming am I concerned about? Special programming. Now, let me ask this question. What is the range of special programming from a radio station that does not have RDS technology? If a radio station has no RDS technology, what is the range of special programming from that radio station? This radio station has no RDS programming. Yeah, I know, who cares, but just for argument. Zero. Zero. So then, can you decrease the range from zero? Is there something called a negative range? Nope. This entire answer choice is illogical, or the impact on range is on other programming. Okay, let's talk about choice D, and this is where choice D is a classical example of people not visualizing the answer choice in the context of the conclusion. Okay, choice D says, in 1996, Worldlanders who did not own radios to receive RDS. Do I care about those radios? Do I care about people who don't have the right radios? Do I care about them at all? In my conclusion, could not receive any programming. Do I care about any programming, or do I only care about RDS programming? Okay, this choice is absolutely wrong. Why? We don't care about people who don't have the RDS radio. Why? Because the argument tells us they cannot receive special programming. We don't care about any programming. Why? Because the conclusion is just about special programming. Type of programming is irrelevant. So we're going to quickly go through the next question. But what did you learn from this solving this question? What did you learn from it? Keep things simple. Don't fall. Think logically. Why don't we care about people not having an RDS radio? Because they can't receive special programming. The argument tells us. If you don't take the GMAT or the GRE, you're not going to get into any reputed school. We shouldn't care about your credentials. Anyway. Okay. Now, let's go into Shelbyville. Don't look at the options first. Trust me, you are going to falter, especially in difficult questions. So, let's see how you guys did for Shelbyville. I'm going to hide this over here. Shelbyville. Here is my Shelbyville. Choice D was very popular. Choice C and choice E were popular as well, as was choice A. Let's kind of look at this over here. So last year, we collected a bunch of refuse. We did not send anything for recycling. But we burned everything. Everything was incinerated. That's what happened last year, and that incineration generated a ton of residual ash. This year, we don't want that. We want to reduce the amount of residual ash to half of what it was last year. So I'm going to recycle a bunch. And if last year I sent 10 trucks for incineration, and let's assume a trash can is a truck, then how many trucks am I going to send this year for incineration? How many trucks am I going to send this year? 5 trucks, right? For incineration over here. Okay. Now let's make sure you understand this argument correctly. Now, if this year instead of collecting the same amount of refuse, if I collect 10 times as much refuse, if this year I collect 10 times as much refuse, how many trucks do you think I'm going to send for incineration this year? If I collect 10 times as much refuse. Okay, let's get those responses in. The question is, if I collect 10 times as much refuse, how many trucks do you think will be sent for incineration this year? 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Let me end the poll, broadcast the results. Only 25% or 26% of you chose choice A, which is 5, which is the correct answer. And only 25% of you got the correct answer for the right reasons. I mean, you got the many more of you got the correct answer, but the reasoning isn't right. The correct answer is just 5 trucks. And let's kind of see why we say this. Let's read the last line. This year, city services will separate for recycling enough refuse to reduce, to is a purpose word, the number of truckloads to be incinerated to half of last year's number. So what it's saying is, regardless of the amount of refuse we collect, I'm only going to send half as many truckloads this year as I sent last year. So even if I collect 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times as much refuse, you're only going to get 5 trucks. Why? Because last year you got 10 trucks. Is that clear? And that's the level of comprehension you guys need to have. What is refuse? Garbage. Not with a dead body, hopefully with his hand coming out, but just garbage. Okay, so we go follow the same thing. This is the main conclusion. We want to reduce the total amount of ash to half of last year's number. This is what makes us believe that's going to happen. Why? Because we're only going to send half as many truckloads. And the first line is a context, so is the second line. So we ask our falsification question. Or we kind of do the logical structure first. I think you guys know this. The falsification question is where we say, under what conditions will the ash generated be greater than 50% if only half as many trucks are sent for incineration? Okay, what is the answer to my falsification question? Say, hey, if half as many trucks are sent and if the total ash would still be greater than 50%, the only possible scenario is if the ash per truckload is higher this year than was generated last year, which means if we stuff those trucks with so much garbage that they generate a ton more ash. Okay, what's my assumption? The ash per truckload is going to be similar to or lower than what we had last year. From which statement do you make the falsification statement? You make it from the conclusion and the logical structure. That's why we do the logical structure. And again, go look at these. We explain this process in intricate detail in the free trial. So do that. Okay. Let's look at answer choices. Choice A says this year no materials that are separated for recycling would be incinerated. Okay. Now this is a classical case of where an answer choice satisfies the must be true condition but provides no new information. Okay, what its choice is saying is recyclable material is not to be incinerated. Why is it wrong? It's wrong because I can infer this from the factual part of the argument. Okay, whatever that where we can really say that whatever is separated is not going to be sent for incineration. Can I show the question? Yes, absolutely. Here is the argument. By the way you should read is you shouldn't have to worry about the argument while you go through the answer choices. So get into the habit of reading that. So it's an inference. Yes, this one is an inference. When you say this year the city services will separate enough refuse to reduce the number of truckloads, you can really say that, hey, if it's separated, then you're not going to be sending it for incineration. Okay. Now, choice B talks about the costs. Here is the poll over here. You guys can really see this. Very few of you chose choice B because cost is not a problem over here. Choice C talks about the proportion of recyclable materials. And again, it's irrelevant. Why? Because we are only going to send half as many truckloads for incineration. So everything else is completely irrelevant over here. Because we only generate ash when you incinerate something, and we are told that we are only going to get half as many truckloads. We're taking that as a fact. Choice D is in line with our pre-thinking. It talks about ash per truckload. Okay, and which is the correct answer. If you negate choice B, you see the conclusion breaks down. Why? Because in this case, if you negate choice B, you get more ash per truckload. If you get more ash per truckload, even if you get half as many truckloads, your total amount of residual ash becomes quite a bit. And choice E, which is also very popular, about 20% of you chose choice E, talks about the total quantity or total amount of residual ash. And again, it's irrelevant. Why? Because regardless of the amount of refuse you collect, we are only going to send half as many truckloads. What did you learn from this question? What did you learn from this question? I'm going to tell you where you get the recording. It's important to put the answers in the context of question only. Pre-thinking is very critical. The more you start doing pre-thinking, the more you're going to really understand the logic that the author uses. Okay. So that's really, really important. I'm going to briefly show choice B. Choice B talks about, choice B is actually not close to it at all. Choice B. Wrong choice B. Sorry about that. Here is choice B actually over here. Here is choice B, the cost of disposing. Okay, let's talk about the plan now. Let's move forward very quickly. So one thing which I want to make sure that we do is, you guys understand that pre-thinking isn't rocket science. Okay, and that's something which actually, let me just look at a question. If we reduce the amount of refuse by taking out the recyclable items from it, won't the loads of the trucks be reduced? Yes, is that a must be true? Again, remember, what's an assumption? Ashish, can you help some books and articles to read that help build visualization? Or there are no books written on it. That's something which you can only get from an audio-visual course. Our inference module is an excellent module to build visualization on statements. And then as you go and look at our concepts, you're going to really see that all builds on visualization around arguments. If you don't do inference properly, you're not going to get there. And no one teaches you. Why? Because in the US, you learn this visualization when in 6th to 12th grade. So pre-thinking is not rocket science, and as you use pre-thinking, you're able to achieve way higher accuracy. You're able to get to the answers faster. Why? Because it crystallizes your thinking. It does take some time to build that skill, but as soon as you do this, you're going to find yourself doing much better. Okay, so as next steps, make sure you go through these 3 files over here. 1, 2, 3, and you can reach me at rajat@e-GMAT. We're here. Now, If you're a paid student, make sure you go through the premise and conclusion files first. If you have not, then you go through inference module. It's a very elaborate module. It's a module that will help build that visualization capability. So spend a good 12 hours on that module. Trust me, this investment would make sure that you breeze through the assumption module, and then as you get to evaluate, strengthen, and weaken, you're going to find that you end up taking 2 or 3 hours to go through one module. Okay, and go through that. And in each of these core modules, you get evaluated on this, and you get feedback that's personalized to your skill level in every concept file, every concept quiz, every application file, and every practice quiz. So you get in every module, you're going to get about 10 feedback points at least. And the inference module, you get about 20 plus feedback points over there. Use that feedback to revise areas that the system's telling you that you need to revise. Okay. And then you should practice in our Scholarium platform. Okay. So how do you do this? First, go through the course, make sure you get 80% scores in concept and application files, as well as our practice quizzes. Then go through Scholarium. Scholarium already has cementing quizzes. Take them, then go through ability quizzes over there. And one thing you've got to understand is that this is an environment which is very different from a typical book or a typical course. In a typical book or a typical course, you learn all the concepts, then you practice questions. We don't do that. We teach you the concepts, we evaluate you on the concepts, then we teach you the application and evaluate you on the application, then we do qualifying exercises. So when we teach you inference, we teach you the concepts, and then we teach you how to apply those concepts. And while you're doing all of this, you're solving questions. And in the qualifying exercises, just on inference, you're solving questions. So you perfect your skill in inference, then you perfect your skill in assumptions, then evaluate, then strengthen, then weaken. Okay. And this, because of this integrated learning environment and the fact that you're taught application about 20 times during just the learning phase, this is way more efficient. Your hit rate in the first go is a lot higher. Okay. Now, if you're a paid student, this is just your assumption module, by the way. And what you see over here with regards to that skill building piece is, and I'm going to just expand this piece over here. You get an introduction to assumption, but then you learn how to pre-think on arguments that test just your ability to identify the logical gap, on arguments that compare two entities, and arguments that actually talk about segments in a certain context, and arguments that compare apples to oranges, and then in quant focused arguments. So you kind of truly build on that skill. Each one of these files is about a 25 to 30-minute lesson over here with built-in exercises. So you get evaluated at them right then and there. Once you go through these, you actually get a score over here that comes in. Then we teach you how to apply this again. So actually the application part already starts from this point onwards, which is 3.4 onwards over here. And then here you have a set of formal application, and then practice, and then you have the OG quizzes. So application L1 is level 1 application L2 is level 2, and then you have practice, and then if you went through all of this in this live session, would have been the most impactful. Now, how do you get to those 100+ point score improvements? Apply pre-thinking religiously. Don't time yourself. Rather, focus on reviewing the solutions. Practice official guide questions as prescribed in the course, and get a good hit rate. If you don't get 80%, go revise the relevant portions. Why? Because if you don't get 80%, what it tells you is that you've not absorbed everything. So when you revise this right then and there, you fix those gaps right then and there, which means they don't carry on. Okay. With that, just to really tell you how comprehensive this is and why you don't need to do as many official questions when you go through the course, is because this is about 6 to 10 times as comprehensive as any other resource out there. And this is just the sequence that you're going to go through in the course. Don't go through any other resource, please. It's just going to get conflicting. It's going to take you away from pre-thinking. And here's an example of a student who did this really quickly. Bhavya went from, oh, sorry, this is Anupriya. She went from V32 to V46 in about 20 days or so. And V46 is essentially 99 percentile. So with that, go take a look at the concepts in the free trial and see how you build your ability in pre-thinking. Sati says, okay, let me actually look at a few other questions. What should be the correct way about practicing CR? Scholarinium, OG, verbal review. So Ashish, go through the course first. Do not skip the course. Then do the cementing quizzes in Scholarinium. If you hit the metrics in cementing quizzes, which is greater than 70% accuracy in medium and hard, then I think you're all set. You don't even need to solve a whole lot of official guide questions. Okay. Can we design your study plan? Yes, we can. Just go and schedule, book a slot over here. Let me just go in and book a slot with one of our GMAT strategy experts over here. The videos on the portal are great. Well, thank you, Satish. I am glad you like them. When can you take the exam? So my understanding is you can take the online GMAT exam right away. That's what I would recommend. One of the other things that there is, I know many of you are worried about the whiteboard. From what I understand, there could be some updates on the whiteboard that are coming over. Also, my personal understanding is, having used the whiteboard on the verbal section, the whiteboard is a great boom. We have created many videos in which we tell you how to use the whiteboard. Let me just share some of those videos. Here is a video that shows about how to use a CR question using the whiteboard over here. Okay, guys, before you go, you can actually download the PDF. But on this short answer pod, if you could please share some feedback on the webinar, that would be super helpful. Can I explain how my course differs from the likes of Veritas and Experts Global? First of all of those courses are built around what I call as a book-based learning architecture. So the first difference is architecture, book-based versus private tutoring. In our CR course, and which is also true for every other course that we offer, you get feedback about 85 times. And this is just the learning portion of it. When you go into Scholarinium, you get more feedback. When you go into our tests, you get a lot more feedback over there. So overall, we evaluate across quant and verbal a student 500 times. You get that feedback 500 times. When you look at Veritas Prep, you're going to probably get that number for Veritas Prep would be about 20 times. So 20 versus 500. Experts Global, that number would be way lower. And why is it that we can give that feedback? Why? Because we built our own content, we built our own technology, where every minute of video that is being watched is being tracked in the platform, and you're being evaluated over here. Okay. That's one piece. The second piece is focus on application. I mean, you go through this, you look at the concept of pre-thinking. You can evaluate anyone's methods. You're not going to find a step-by-step approach towards pre-thinking. The third thing, who's teaching? Most of these people talk about 99 percentile instructors. If you go to Veritas Prep and all, what they won't tell you is how do those instructors rate on the platform. I mean, what's the rating of those instructors. When you look at e-GMAT instructors, what you're going to find is uh, 4 out of world's five highest rated instructors work on Veritas Prep. Oh, sorry, work for e-GMAT. What am I saying? Um, Here is where you can really look at the ratings of instructors over here. Do I think the test? So those are the 3 things. The 4th, 5th, and 6th, personalized study plans, support that offers awesome SLA, mentors that do just GMAT strategy support. So I mean, there are many differences. If you want to really understand that, just schedule a session with one of our mentors, and they'll walk you through this. The question that you should be asking is, why is it that e-GMAT has close to 2,000 reviews, whereas most of the other prep companies have fewer than 200? Or when you go to GMAT Club, share GMAT experience and look at the e-GMAT tag, why is it that we have 5 times, 6 times as many success stories? Or when you go to our YouTube channel, why is it that we have way more success story interviews than any other prep company does? Well, so where can you get these files? Just log into your e-GMAT free trial. You should be able to do that. Santosh says, what would be the ideal GMAT score? Again, in this pod, guys, on the right, feedback on the webinar would be great. Ideal doctoral score for HBS ideal score for HBS's doctoral program, I'd say 750. No less than 750. Do we have any other sessions? We do, yes. We talked about the sessions up front. We have, let me just bring in over here. We have a session on algebra tomorrow. We have then another session next week, which is on how to build your study plan. So here are some free sessions. Let me just hide the PDF over here. And you can register for both of these sessions. Okay. What would be the difference between online GMAT and GMAT at the test center? In my opinion, actually the online GMAT is better. Why? Because you do this in the comfort of your house. If you have a reliable internet connection, which by the way, if you didn't have problems during this webinar, you do have a reliable internet connection, that you should go for an online GMAT. It's in the comfort of your house, in the comfort of essentially your own machine, and in the time slot of your choosing. So, and from what I understand, in a couple of days there would be an announcement related to whiteboard. Do we think that the test centers will open up in August? It just depends on where you're talking about. In the US, I think they will open up. In India, I think they will open up, but again, I'm not the one making the decisions. Should you go to the test center versus taking the test at home? My opinion is that that you should take the test from home, just because I think it's safer for you. But again, and that's why on our platform we've enabled the whiteboard for every question on our platform. When you for our mocks, you can take the mocks in a platform which in the online GMAT format, which means if you can toggle a switch and it'll really give it in the same way that you'd get the online GMAT test. No, in the past I asked the question of our online GMAT. I didn't say it isn't good. We are not poets and quants or GMAT Club. In fact, we have a YouTube channel in which we talk about how do you solve questions using the whiteboard. So and we've been doing that for quite some time over here. I mean, we would not be updating our platform to support the whiteboard if we thought. I just want to make sure that you get this. So if you go to this playlist, you can really see over here. Sandeep says, if I have a choice to postpone my MBA plans, is it smart to wait for the GMAT to switch back to test centers instead of online option? Sandeep, one of the things that I look at to really evaluate stuff is what's is called a strategic options approach. So the cost of taking the online GMAT is $200. Okay. Uh, if you prepare well, you're going to do well on the online GMAT. That's my strong belief. That's what the data shows us based on what we see on forums. People who prepare for the online GMAT do well. If you've not used the whiteboard and you go into the format cold, you're going to screw it up. But if you prepare using the whiteboard, you're going to do really well. Why? Because the whiteboard on the verbal section and for most of the quant section uh, is, is, um, is a boon over here. So worst case, you take the online GMAT, you don't do as well. Are those $200 worth 1 year of not doing an MBA, Sandeep? Because the preparation doesn't go wasted. It's just those $200 in the worst case. Is that worth wasting a year? If it's worth wasting a year, then yes, you should wait. If it's not, then in my opinion, take the test, get there. If you think from a career standpoint, you are ready. From an application standpoint, you are ready, then don't wait. If you're not ready from a career or an application standpoint, if you think, hey, you need to get more experience and then your profile would be good, then wait. Target accuracy for hard questions to get a 730 plus score. So I want about 65%. 65% on hard questions means you'd get to 90th percentile, which means you'll get to a V42, V43, which is a good thing for 730 plus score. Ideal score for SET Business School, Yale, and HBS. So there's, I mean, if you get a 740, you're good for all of them. I mean, there's no ideal score for HBS. I mean, it takes across. Does online GMAT also allow sending reports to 5 business schools? Actually, the advantage of online GMAT is that you can send your scores to as many business schools as you want, free of charge. So the actual, the in-center GMAT gives you the option of sending the scores to 5 schools. The online GMAT gives you the option of sending the scores to 15, 20. So when you go for the in-person GMAT, if you want to send the score to 15 schools, you pay $250, $25 per school. But with the online one, you won't pay a penny extra. Yes, all are free, Satish. Yes, unlimited. You want to send their scores to 1,000 schools? Not a problem. Will not having an AW have an impact? Not really. So no. Won't past bad scores affect admissions? No, not really. I mean, most schools consider your highest scores. If you go to the success stories on our platform, you're going to find that essentially many people take the test multiple times and do really well. Let me actually share some links with you. Here is a guy who took the GMAT 4 to 5 times, got admitted to Columbia with scholarship over here. Okay, all right, let me just see this over here. Is it advised to do pre-thinking in the mind or right aside the structure? So do what your mind tells you. Remember, this is a learning exercise, which means that early on you may have to write things down, and as you get more comfortable, as you develop that ability to comprehend more information, you need to write down less and less. Okay, so early on you may be taking longer, and that's okay, but you would get to it. Here's another guy who actually faced this journey over here. How often should you be giving mocks? If you're in the e-GMAT platform, you probably should be giving mocks after you're done with learning. So the first 2 months, don't take mock tests. Why? Because we have ability quizzes. We have so many other ways of assessment. You should take mocks when you are 70 to 80% ready. Again, if you've created a study plan with one of our mentors, you would get that answer over there. If you've not, then work on a study plan with one of our mentors, and they will tell you when should you be taking mocks. Satish says, so my understanding is in all aspects, the online exam is found to be better than the one in test center. So the exam is the same, Satish. Remember this, okay? The exam is the same. In my opinion, if you have a reliable internet connection and if you can find a place in your house which is quiet enough, you should take the online test, but you should prepare for it, which means you should prepare using the whiteboard, or if the GMAT changes the whiteboard to a scratch pad, which I kind of hope that they do in the next 2 days based on a few things that I am privy to. I think if those two conditions are true for you, then yes, I think the online experience would be much better. Okay, does that help answer your question, Satish? Why? Because you take the test in the comfort of your house. The chair, the table, the computer would all be your own. You'd be comfortable with it. The entire location is going to be your own. You can take it on a Sunday at a time slot that you prefer. And the test is the same, by the way. Hari says, I have an experience of 3 years in IT. Is this the right thing to do an MBA, or should you get more experience? Hari, again, depends on what kind of experience you have. From just purely a number of years standpoint, that's fine as long as that experience has a few substantial things. If the experience does not have anything substantial to it, you can work for another 3 years and it's not going to be any different. So if you've shown leadership in those 3 years, if you've if you've had significant achievements in those 3 years, then yes, 3 years is plenty. $30 years. Does it make sense? It depends on what you need. And here's an article that we wrote. Many of our students do an MBA at 34, 35, 36, and they really like it. The question really is, why are you doing an MBA? What are you trying to achieve? Is it just financial gain? Is it personal fulfillment? Is it career progress? And for some people, it's all three. And then, an MBA over 30 makes really, really good sense. 4 years ago, I visited UCLA Anderson in Los Angeles. The oldest student in their class of 2020, who's in full-time MBA program, was 47 years old. And the guy was very happy with it. Do schools consider graduate GPA or undergraduate GPA? I have an MS degree and I've scored, don't have a very high GPA. Let me just. So I think what's very high and what's not very high is something which would depend on various, from case to case, and the scenario in which he didn't have a very high GPA. Do they care? Do they consider one over the other? I would say they consider the latter one over the former one. So if you had a very low undergrad and a high grad, that would work. But if you had a high undergrad and a low grad, then you'd have to justify it. That's what I would say. You can justify it, but you would need to. Because the schools would be concerned, did you stop worrying about studies? So that's something, Darshan, you should do. Okay, I don't see any other questions in the Q&A pod over here. If there are no other questions. Okay, Satish's question. Satish says, suppose during the online GMAT there's an internet drop, what would happen? In that case, if the internet drop lasts a certain amount of time, you'd have an issue. The way and to go around this, which by the way you should do it regardless of whether you're taking the online GMAT, is to get what I call as a small battery pack for your router, a power pack for your router, and in that case, even if you have a power cut, if you're using your laptop would continue, and if you have that power pack for your router, which is something that we are doing for all our employees worldwide, uh, because everyone's working from home, and we have a significant number of people in India, so uh, that it just makes sense for us to have a power pack that has a 4-hour battery backup, and these packs cost like $1,000 or so, 1,000 Indian rupees, or about 15-16. So it's 5 years of experience too much for a full-time 2-year MBA in India? Actually, no. I think for me that's the sweet spot. What's the average time spent per CR question? About between a minute 30 to 2 minutes 15. It's a range, and everyone's different, trust me. The question says, "Hey, I finished my Sigma X mock test and I gave the actual test. I didn't get a good score. How can I get more tests?" So, Mr. Test, just write to us. We can tell you how to simulate tests using Scholaranium. Okay. All right, guys. If you can't register for the GMAT strategy webinar, let me. Why is it that the register now one is not working? I'm sorry. No, it is working actually. If you can't register for the GMAT strategy webinar, then you can click on this link that should appear in the Q&A pod right now over here. Okay. All right, guys, with that, I want to thank everyone for joining me today. You guys stayed with me for quite some time, and it was a pleasure hosting you. Thank you for participating wholeheartedly, and I look forward to seeing you in the webinar tomorrow, which is on GMAT Algebra, and then on the webinar on Wednesday. Okay. I have another question. How do you build your profile? Let me just look at this, and I'm going to share some articles over there. Here's a generic article that you can really look at, and then here is one more. One around the resume, and again, this is what B schools value. So this is a really great article that you guys can read. All right, guys, bye bye, and have a great rest of the day.